Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. If you are watching, go ahead and let us know. Send a comment if you're watching on YouTube or in the Facebook group. You can say hi so that we can see that we've got folks here. And that would be great. We're here with Joe Casabona today, so we'll jump into that in just a minute. Really quick, I just want to say a couple of words about GoWP in case anyone watching isn't fully familiar with us. At GoWP, we like to say that we create happiness for digital agencies and help them to become more profitable. So whether you're looking to grow your team with a developer, copywriter, designer, or project manager, or virtual assistant, you're interested in outsourcing your services so you can focus on growth. We have white labeled managed services like unlimited content edits, maintenance, those sorts of things that we take care of as a part of your team so you can focus on growing your business. So if you're interested in having a conversation about how you can partner with GoWP to grow your business and increase profits, we'd love to have that talk. You can reach out to me or just go to gowp.com and check us out. And we've got a little chat bot there that you can reach out to us. We've also built the Digital Agency Owners community, which is an active community of over 2,000 agency owners. We hold calls like this, so we do our expert series, webinars like this one with Joe Casabona, and we also have great conversations over there. So we'd love for you to join us if you're not already a member, and I'll put the link in the chat so you can check that out. But yeah, let's jump into it. So today, we are here with our podcasting and automation expert, Joe Casabona. He's a whiz when it comes to all of these things. If you've been on any of our happiness hour calls or anything, you know that Joe has a productivity hack for basically anything. He can help you out with that. And he's a master podcaster. So he's really the go-to guy, our go-to guy for all podcasting and automation questions. So we're really lucky to have him here. So thank you, Joe. Today, he's going to be talking about 7 hidden mistakes that podcasters make. So I'm excited to hear this. I know I can already identify some of mistakes I've made on our podcast, but I'm interested to hear if they make the list. So Joe, over to you.
All right. Well, thanks, Emily, for having me. I'm really excited. I love talking about this because these are things that I thought were obvious to me, but it turns out not not necessarily obvious to people who don't eat, sleep, and breathe podcasts like I do. So let's dive into it. I'm going to share my screen here, and I'm going to do I'm living dangerously. I'm going to share the whole screen because I do eventually want to switch to Apple Podcasts and show you kind of some of the results of what these changes can do. So I'm sharing my whole screen, I think. Woo! Totally am. And we're gonna go over here and I'm going to do this presentation. How to make $1 million on Meta Threads. I'm just kidding. We're gonna talk about 7 hidden mistakes you're making with your podcast. So I'm just gonna dive right into them. We're gonna talk a little bit. If there are any questions, feel free to ask them as I go along, and then I'm gonna show you again like what this looks like in Apple Podcasts. And I should say that this is the same stuff I do for my podcast audits. So if you are playing along, you can do this thing along with your podcast as well. So number one is check your podcast title. Uh, I always say that clear is better than clever. And so you can have a clever name, but if it's not a name that people are searching for, then no one's going to find it. And so a really good example is actually my own, uh, how I built it for one, right? But the other one I had was called Make Money Podcasting at first. And I thought, this is amazing. I can't believe no one has a podcast named Make Money Podcasting. And it's because nobody was looking for a podcast like that. And so then I renamed it the Profitable Podcaster, which actually might have been worse. And so I just renamed it again, podcast workflows, which falls in line with my newsletter. So now at least there's some name recognition there. But uh, I guess the lesson, the hidden lesson The Easter egg within the Easter egg is that nothing you do is set in stone, right? You can rename your podcast, you can update it. And what I've been doing lately is uh, pejoratively keyword stuffing, right? But it's not really keyword stuffing. It's adding a little extra context to the title. So, How I Built It was originally called just How I Built It. Now it's called How I Built It: Case Studies and Coaching for creators and solopreneurs, right? Um, it just tells people exactly who the show is for within the title. And I do this within the title because in Apple Podcasts, at least the last time I checked, I'm pretty sure this is still the case, but in Apple Podcasts, when you do a search, it doesn't include the description in what's indexed. It only includes the title. So you want a descriptive but not annoyingly long title. So that's the first thing I would recommend. Um, I guess along with this, I would say unless you're like a known quantity, you don't need your name in your podcast. Like nobody cares about the Joe Casabona show, right? Like my kids don't care. Only Joe cares about the Joe Casabona show. So if you have a show with your name in the title, I would seriously consider changing that. Um, if you're a brand, right, and you want the brand, that's fine. Um, but I would consider that I would reconsider like having the Joe Casabona show, right? Because again, people aren't necessarily looking for you; they're looking for a problem to solve, right? And so there's another way that you can do that that I'll talk about in a minute. Number 2 is optimize your description. This is a huge mistake I see all the time, right? I've seen people just like copy their about page into the Apple Podcast description. I would see people repeat the name of the podcast right at the beginning of the description. So you see the name and then you see the name again as the first thing in the description. You want your podcast title to read like a movie synopsis because people are always thinking, what's in it for me? This is what they want. They don't care about on this podcast, right? They're probably in a podcast app. They know that this is a podcast. You don't need to include that. What they want to know is what problem do you solve? Because 78% of people listen to podcasts to solve a problem. And how do you solve it and who do you solve it for, right? I might have talked about podcast mission statement on one of these live streams, but the mission statement template for me is my podcast helps audience solve problem by and then the goal of each episode. Your description should also read something like that, right? If it's a podcast on let's say Lindsay Halsey is starting a podcast, right? She's another one of the experts here at GoWP. If she's starting a podcast about local SEO, let's say, right? The opening line of the description of this podcast can be, um, do people in your town struggle finding your business despite ranking well on Google? Question mark, right? Oh, yeah. I mean, like, people traveling or people from New York City might find my store, but, like, people in my town of Denver don't. What's going on with that, right? Then she might go on I didn't ask Lindsay about this, she's the first person that came to my mind. Um, she then she would go on to say, "You need to do X, Y, and Z to optimize locally." Listen to Pathfinder SEO podcast. To I didn't double check any of this stuff either, so I think this is all right. Um, Double check Pathfinder SEO podcast or listen to Pathfinder SEO podcast to get the best insights and tips from industry experts on how to rank locally. Um, Emily can correct me on this. I don't know if they focus strictly on local SEO, but that was just the topic I picked for them. I know they do SEO. Um, so this is what you want your description to look like. You want someone to read the description of your podcast and then go, I need to listen to this podcast because it helps me. So that's description. The other thing you want to do is update your artwork, right? Most people find podcasts and podcast apps. And so when they search for something, they're just hit with a wall of artwork, right? It's like going to the bookstore and just seeing a bunch of um, book spines, right? Or book covers. You want yours to stand out. There are a few things you can do, right? First, you want the text as big as possible so that people can read it as they're scrolling. People are attracted to smiling faces, right? But I'm not saying put a face on your podcast. I don't. I think my podcast did worse after I put my face on my podcast. I don't know why. But you want to optimize your artwork for this. So I'll usually say you want the name as big as possible. You want maybe a couple of words that stand out, right? Again, if I'm going to force Lindsay to have a local SEO podcast, right? It might say Pathfinder SEO podcast, local SEO done right, right? Maybe those are the words, and then maybe a picture of her and her co-founder, who's, oh my god, her name is escaping me. I'm really sorry. I know both of them. So that might be what their artwork looks like, right? Or maybe it's just like a beautiful, like scenic picture. I think they're based in Colorado, so maybe like Colorado, right? Because that's local, right? But you want your artwork to stand out. The thing I would recommend you do is search for your show or look for your show in the category your podcast is in and look at all of the artwork, right? In the business podcasts, it's like brooding dude, arms folded, name looking intensely or whatever, dark background, right? How do you stand out on that, right? If you go to the politics podcast, it's like the same thing. It's like person looking very serious at the camera and then like name of podcast. How do you make yourself stand out on that page? Optimize your number 4 is optimize your episode titles and descriptions. This is the same thing. You want someone to come across an episode and be enticed to listen to it. You want that to read like a movie synopsis as well. So what you don't want is episode number colon guest name. That is boring, and no one cares about the episode number. I guess this is like my tough love section of this, but no one cares how many episodes of your podcast you have. And most people probably don't care about the guest. Some people will and definitely include the guest name. But instead, you want to have, again, the problem this episode solves, right? Um, why local SEO is different in Amarillo with Johnny Amarillo. It's terrible. The name that works, I guess. Oh, now I'm from Amarillo. Like, why does local SEO work differently here, right? So that's the title, right? The episode number is probably going to be displayed anywhere in somewhere in the podcast app anyway, right? So like that is not important information to anybody except you and the podcast app. And then the description, right? Most descriptions start with, in this episode, guest name tells us about. In this episode is redundant. We already have guest name somewhere in the title. So now we're seeing the guest name twice. And that doesn't hook me, right? What hooks me would be something like, is this the way to Amarillo, right? Because that's a song. That's an obscure song reference. Question mark, or something better that I'm maybe not thinking of off the top of my head. But it's a hook that gets people to listen, right? I remember the last time I was in Amarillo, I was standing outside a dark apartment and I wasn't sure where to go. What? Why? And then you get into kind of what the episode's going to talk about and why the person should listen. But you want it to read like a movie synopsis. You want to hook the reader. And this is true in app. It's also true on your website, because like here's the super secret 7th or 8th thing. You should have a website for your podcast, because this is where you're going to get actual SEO juice from, right? And so if people are Googling Amarillo local SEO, you want that episode to rank, and you don't want the meta description to be, in this episode, Johnny Amarillo talks about local SEO in Amarillo, right? That's not going to get people to click through. So those are the things you want to think about for your episode titles and descriptions. Number 5, improve your intro. Again, intros to podcasts all kind of go the same way. Oh, so like a small aside here is that you should be editing your podcast, right? No one wants to hear a raw, No one wants to hear the raw conversation. And this is this is something I hear from my students and I hear from other people who hire me like, oh no, people want to hear like that's what Joe Rogan does. And Joe Rogan has 11 million listeners per episode. 11 million downloads per episode. When you get to be as big as Joe Rogan, you can do the Joe Rogan things. But until then, you need to edit your podcast because you need to tell a story. And the thing that will get people to listen to the story is an intro that hooks them. So a podcast that does this especially well is History Daily by Lindsey Graham, not that Lindsey Graham. He's a really great storyteller, and he has a daily history podcast. And he could just say it could be a 2-minute episode, right? On this day in history, Napster was founded, right? That's today's episode. But it doesn't start like that. It starts with 18-year-old Sean Fanning was sitting in his dorm room. He had been coding for hours. He just took a sip of his soda. And then there's like a burp in the background. There's crumpling paper. There's a can crunching. He's been staring at a new app he's built called Napster that will help people download music from their friends without having to buy albums. Whoa, I know about Napster. Sean, this guy just painted a picture in my head, right? That sort of thing is what's going to get people to listen. So if you're thinking, oh, I have a business podcast, you still have a story to tell, right? You have, Johnny Amarillo remembers the first time he was trying to find a local restaurant in Amarillo. I really wish I hadn't gone with Amarillo for his last name too. Jimmy Gore remembers the first time he was looking for a restaurant in Amarillo. He was frustrated because even though he knew he was close to the downtown, Googling for something came up with no results. He was finding stuff in Houston and Dallas because Joe thinks that Amarillo's in Texas, I'm pretty sure. But he couldn't find anything near him. Frustrated, he gave up and just kept on walking. What happened to Jimmy Gore? Like, why did he where did he find out where he was going? And then you can go into like how important local SEO is for your business, because maybe you just lost a customer. Jimmy Gore could have walked into your restaurant. So if you do like a cold open that entices people to keep on listening, that will be a lot better than, hey, everybody, welcome back. I'm here with Johnny Amarillo. He's going to tell us about local SEO in Amarillo. Johnny, tell us, who are you and what do you do? We're off to a boring start because Johnny's going to be like, what do? I don't know. I help people with local SEO, right? Like that's going to be, we're already off to kind of a rough start, right? So you want the cold open, you want to entice people to listen. I know I spent a lot of time on that part, but I think this is like a thing that people can improve, right? Pull a good quote from your guest or tell a story like that, and you've hooked somebody in the first 30 to 60 seconds because that's all you really have when someone starts listening to an episode after they find you. So your intro is super important. Along with that, number 6, have a clear call to action. Most calls to action are there's too many of them and they're too confusing. Rate us on iTunes, right? iTunes is not the app anymore. Share with a friend, visit the show notes, join our mailing list, leave a rating and review. Also, write in if you have any questions. That's too many things. And most people rattle those things off at the end, and you've lost like 40% of your audience at the end of an episode, right? So what you want to do is, I have been telling people do this first, make it the pre-roll ad. I've changed my mind a little bit after doing research on other podcasts and how they do it. I think the cold open should go first. And again, luckily, I'm like experimenting with some of this now. Luckily, nothing you do is set in stone. You do something for episode 5, you can do something different for episode 6. But I think have the cold open and then have maybe an intro for your show, like a 30-second, this is what the show is about for new listeners, and then a call to action. So you should put it within the first probably 3 minutes of the show because you have everyone's attention at this point. So you say something like, hey, real quick, before we get into the rest of the episode, if you like this, you will love this free resource I have for you. Right. And so for my show, I say, hey, I help busy solopreneurs and creators be more efficient. What if you could get 14 of my favorite automations for free to help you save time. This is what we talk about on the show. I want to give you some of the things we talk about on the show. You can head over to howibuilt.it/automate, sign up for my newsletter, and you'll get my free automations database. That call to action is clear, it's relevant, and it's at the beginning. Okay, so if you want, you could tell people to go to your show notes, right? Where you maybe have a bunch of other stuff. So make sure to say the link to your show notes, make sure it's easily speakable. But getting people on your mailing list is what is going to capture your audience, because podcasting feels like a one-way street. People being on your mailing list, it makes it feel like less of a one-way street. So have a clear call to action. I think that call to action should be join my newsletter. And again, I've changed my mind on this a little bit. I think that instead of putting it right at the very beginning, you could probably still do that, right? If it's like 40 seconds, like people will either just skip or listen through because it's like, oh, well, I'm interested in this, so I'm going to check it out. But if I'm telling you you need to hook the listener in the first minute, spending 40 seconds on a call to action seems at odds, right? Those two statements seem at odds. So I would say cold open, maybe the intro, like what this show is about, and then your call to action. You want to get people before they leave, probably around the midpoint, unless it's just super boring. But within the first 3 or 4 minutes, I would say. Okay. Number 7. This is the most effort, right? Everything else we've talked about up until this point, you can fix like today, and then continue to do. Podcast swaps is an ongoing thing that a lot of people ignore. That is the best way for you to grow your podcast. Like, no cap, as the kids would say. I think I'm using that right. But hands down, best way, right? Again, if you've been on one of these before, if you've seen me talk, you've heard me talk about Friends and how Friends was getting 16 to 17 million views per night on NBC's wildly popular Thursday night TV lineup. And that sounds like a lot, but all you had to do back in the 90s was be in front of a TV when you wanted to watch that TV show, right? Like today, it's like Game of Thrones, 25 million over a weekend. Friends, 16 million in one night. That's the only time you could watch that episode of Friends, probably for a long time. So that was pretty good. But when they did crossover episodes. They did 2 episodes back to back, crossover with the cast of Mad About You, which led into Friends, and the cast of ER, which Friends led into. So what you're doing there now is you're cross-pollinating audiences and you're getting lookalike audiences. And after that, Friends saw a 20-ish% increase, going from 16, 17 million to 26, 27, 28 million. Eventually getting, I think, to 30 million for the season finale. So you want to find lookalike audiences that are similar to your podcast and do swaps with them. What are those swaps? I have a this is organic discovery is really hard. The first 6 things that we talked about will help with organic discovery, but these things will help you um, grow more quickly. And if you don't believe me, I did podcast swaps pretty heavily in 2022. On January 1st, 2022, I was getting 34,000 downloads per month. On December 31st, 2022, I was getting 74,000 downloads per month. So that's more than double from doing podcast swaps. There are 4 types of podcast swaps. There's promo swaps. That's where, do I have a slide for each of these? I do. Promo swaps, feed drops, interview exchange, and crossover episodes. Let's go through each of these really quick. Podcast swaps, you and another host promote each other. So if Emily and I were to do a promo swap, I would say, hey, maybe in lieu of my call to action or as a pre-roll ad, I would say, hey, everybody, real quick before we get started, I want to tell you about another podcast that I think you'd really like because you like my podcast. It's called the GoWP agency, is a word in there. Should have looked this up. Sorry, Emily. I want you to check out the GoWP. I'm going to say agency owners podcast, but I'm pretty sure that's wrong. They interview interesting agency owners and people who can help agencies, and I think you'd really like it. One of my favorite episodes is, episode XYZ. go ahead and check it out over at gowp.com/podcast. And then Emily or Mariah or whoever's hosting right now would do the same thing for me. Hey, everybody, I want to tell you about a podcast. It's called How I Built It. It's hosted by our friend Joe Casabona. Here's one of our favorite episodes, the one where we interviewed Emily. And you can go check it out at howibuilt.it. So that's Podcast Swaps. A host is telling you about the other podcast. Feed drops is where you and another podcast drop a full episode into the feed. Again, this is something that History Daily does really well. They have a Saturday matinee, and so they'll do a feed drop with another history related podcast. Lindsey Graham will come on. He'll tell a little story at the beginning related to the podcast, and then they'll run the full episode uninterrupted. So this is a really good way to bring more content to other people, as well as surface good content for your audience, right? Because podcasting, not a zero sum game, right? I've heard some people say like, why are you like bringing competitors on? That would be like saying to a headlining band, why are you going to have opening bands, right? Like, people want more content. So feed drops are a good way to bring content directly to your audience. Interview exchanges, this is where you and another podcast host interview each other for your own separate podcasts. I did this recently with Chris L. Davis from Automation Bridge for his All Systems Go podcast. He came on How I Built It. It was really great. And so it allows you to go deep with a another podcaster. And then the benefit for you as the host, right, is podcast guesting is another great way to grow your show. Your call to action is, hey, I also have a podcast. It's called this. You can find it in the app you're listening right now, right? You're listening to right now. And then finally, a crossover episode. You and another host record one episode together. And then you record your own intro and outro and release it on each other's feeds. I did this with Nathan Wrigley from the WP Builds podcast. What did I do? I wrote a pretty long article about why speakers should get paid for virtual events. Nathan runs a very popular virtual event where the speakers don't get paid. And so I basically messaged him and I'm like, hey, this is not like shade at you. And he said, like, maybe we can debate this on a podcast. I'm like, that's a great idea. So we recorded once and we released it on each other's feeds. So those are the 4 types of podcast swaps that you can do. And then finally, I alluded to this early. I opened a curiosity loop. That's another way that you can create a good tension in your podcast in the cold open. Update the artist name. So I see a lot of podcasts make the artist name the same as their podcast name, and you're leaving money on the table there, right? So maybe you don't have the Joe Casabona show, but you have How I Built It with host when the artist is Joe Casabona. But I'm going to take it one step further. I interviewed the co-founder of Capshow, which is a podcast AI company. Her name is Deidre Shen, and she says you should include your title in the artist name as well. So I'm running this experiment. I updated my title to Joe Casabona, comma, podcast automation coach. So now not only do people know who I am or who the host of the show is, but also what the host does. So if they want to get in touch, hey, I want automations for my podcast, then they know immediately when they're listening to my show what I do. So I have a little thank you screen here, but I want to jump out of this and go to Apple Podcasts because I want to show you what some of this stuff, the results of some of this stuff, right? So we'll do how I built it, make this bigger so it's not distracting. So I search how I built it, right? And so you can see there's a few. I'm like in the first column, I'm gonna guess it goes that way. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't though. So I show up here, right? And so you can see how I built. Well, maybe you can't see because I'm not zoomed. I don't know if I can zoom in. Um, but if I click through to this, you could probably see it a little bit better. Um, how I built it, case studies and coaching for creators and solopreneurs. And then, well, I'm already listening to an episode. So I want to go back here. Okay. So The description is down here, right? This one's for the busy solopreneurs who can't spend more time on their business. Each week, host Joe Casabona talks about how you can build a better business through smarter processes, time management, and effective content creation. And then I talk about how I do it and why I'm good and what you should do, right? And then the creator is Joe Casabona, podcast automation coach. So that is how I built it. And again, if I search how I built it, I'm ranked in the top 10, either 2 or 6, depending on which way they lay these out. Now, logic would tell you 6. If I search case studies, I am ranked number 5 or number 6. Nope, number 8. There are 12 here. I just realized. Anyway, I'm presumably ranked higher for the word case studies, right? Um, and similarly, if I do, let's see, if I do coaching for creators, I haven't tested this one. I tested case studies. Coaching for creators, number 1. So that's very exciting, right? And I did those other 2 searches to, and you saw like I wasn't just ranked number 1 because it's my show. Apple doesn't really know that. And then I have a bunch of episodes too listed down here, which is super exciting, right? Um, I did something similar for my podcast workflows podcast. So if I search podcast workflows, I'm the first one that comes up here. Podcast workflows improve your production process by learning from pros. Joe Casabona, podcast automation coach. And then the description, you love your podcast, but you spend too much time on it. Don't worry, you're not alone. Hooked, right? Oh, I do spend too much time on my podcast. I felt like I was alone. Um, the last thing I want to do here before we go to any questions that might have come in or Emily might have is I want to give a shout out to my friend Deb. She's one of my coaching clients, but her podcast is about to cross 10,000 downloads in the first few months. So very exciting for Deb. If I search for how I built it here, uh, how I built it, I should have just used my shortcut. Um, Again, it shows up here in Spotify, how I built it, and then the about is up higher here. I'm gonna just try coaching for creators. That's the top result. Now, the slight problem here is that Spotify does know that this is my show, so maybe they are. Huh, that's really interesting. Um, this I'm gonna bookmark this. This looks like the artwork was stolen from my friend Jay Klaus, so I'm gonna send that to him later. Um, Anywho, so I just wanted to show you kind of how something that you should do is um, look at how your podcast looks in the apps, because then you'll see like, hey, this is what users are seeing, right? Um, so I do see some comments coming in here. Um, digital agency owners podcast. How was I close? Oh, I didn't see the private chat here, Emily. I'm sorry. Um, I was close though. I think I forgot the word digital. I can't see any of this when I'm screen sharing, which makes perfect sense. But those are the things that I had. There's a couple of other things that are not on that I didn't have on the slides, that I might recommend you do, right? Like, and I kind of alluded to this. Don't ask, um, who are you and what do you do? That is a very rote and boring question most of the time. Sometimes it's good, right? It's like you do so much, like how would you describe it? But you want to get to the good stuff as quickly as possible. And so you can include the biographical information in a cold open, which is what you should do anyway, because it's going to be more concise, right? Joe Casabona is a podcast automation coach who helps solopreneurs save 40 hours per month by improving their podcast processes. That is a lot more concise than if somebody asks me, "So Joe, who are you and what do you do?" "Oh, well, I do a lot. You know, I used to be a web developer. I got into that when I was 14. But lately I've helped people with podcasts," right? I wouldn't say the 40 hours thing because that's like a a bio that I wrote and not how I actually talk. So if you have a guest, give the biographical information yourself. And then um don't open with that first question. Open with diving right into if I'm Lindsay and we're talking about Johnny Amarillo, um I might say, so Johnny, what is the deal with local SEO in Amarillo? And then he could dive into his diatribe on why local SEO is sorry to people in Amarillo, Texas, by the way. I just picked that because the song is stuck in my head. Um, and so that was just the first one that came to mind. Also, sorry, Lindsay, if I've put you on the hook for a podcast now. But you want if you have a guest, you want them to get into the stuff they're really passionate about as soon as possible, because you want your listeners to start getting takeaways as soon as possible. So that's what I would say there. And then the other thing is that you do want to tell a story, right? So I see a question here from Amy. What are your favorite questions to get to the juicy stuff when you're interviewing someone? This is a really good question, and it's going to change per guest, right? What I would recommend you do is two things. You need to do a little bit of research, right? I've heard people say, like, I don't do any research. I want to be surprised right when my guest is. And I say I've heard people say that because I used to say that, right? For the first 150 episodes of my podcast, I made all of the mistakes that I just walked through here. It was like episode blah with blah. It was in this episode, we're going to talk to blah, blah about blah, blah. And then I would say, hey, blah, blah, tell us who are you and what do you do? Um, so what I would recommend is you don't have to do a ton of research, right? Again, my friend Jay Klaus, who has the podcast Creator Science, he says he wants to be surprised. But he also says, like, he usually has people on and he's already familiar with their work. What he doesn't want it to do is sound like a profile. And that makes perfect sense, right? You're not making a documentary about this person. You are having a conversation. So you want to strike the right balance. So what I would say is do a little bit of research to figure out their area of expertise and the things that they talk about. Um and the and the things that they talk about. Then do a pre-interview. Andrew Warner and some other podcasters will say, like, you need a completely separate pre-interview, different from the day you record. I mean, I have my pre-interview for about 20 minutes before we actually record. It's a nice way to get warmed up. It's a nice way, if you don't know the person, to chat. We literally chat about the weather first. Usually, if I don't know the person, I'm like, so, like, where are you from? What's the weather like there? Cool. I'm from New York, but I keep my accent on a low burn. And then that usually opens things up. And so, Amy, to get to the root of your question, it's doing this research and knowing the stuff that they're passionate about, and then having a pre-interview where they get warmed up a little bit to make them more open to answer interesting things, right? So you're talking and maybe you say, "Hey, I like to be just, like, super transparent on this podcast. Are you comfortable sharing real numbers with us?" Right? And that's the kind of stuff that that would get you to the juicy information, right? So you wouldn't just come out cold and be like, "So how much money did you make last year?" Well, like, somebody literally asked me that in one of my talks. They're like, "So how much money do you make?" I'm like, "What? Like, that's not even relevant to this talk. It's a little inappropriate. I don't know you." But if you say, "Wow, like, so your business has been going for 7 years, but you've really started to pick up steam in the last 2. How has that impacted your revenue? Are you making more money? How has it impacted your life?" Right? Like, those sort of questions that can pull things out. Um, those sort of things will pull real information out, right? And it's more about trust and comfort than it is about asking the hard hitting questions, right? And so, like, I do this a lot. So anytime I go on a podcast and someone's like, "Is there anything that's off limits?" I'm like, "I'm a pretty open book. Like, don't ask me, like, the address of my kid's school or whatever, right? And that's fine. But like anything about me and the topic we're talking about, like that's I'm pretty open on that, right? So that it's more about comfort and knowing a little bit about your guest going into the interview. Um, it says Facebook user here. I'm gonna guess it's Zach because I see Zach in the Facebook chat. How can I stop being so boring on dev chats? Um, that's really funny. I can't vouch for that. For the boring part, I can't speak to if you're boring, or not. But I think that that's about making guests more comfortable too, and being a little bit prepared, right? Because when you are unprepared, and I'm not saying you are, full disclosure, I have not listened to dev chats, at least not in a while. Um, if when you're unprepared, you vamp a little bit and then you start to lose energy. And you know what? Like the camera steals energy and the microphone steals energy. So you've got to be like a little higher than you normally would to come across as normal anyway. But if you have a guest on, you want to warm them up a little bit. And like Zach, man, I mean, I was a developer too, and I would interview developers. Sometimes it was like pulling teeth getting developers to talk. So like you want to make them comfortable, you want to gauge them a little bit to see like where their comfort level is and kind of adjust. But tell stories. Stories are a great way to not be boring. Um this is a worry for all hosts. Yeah, Emily, absolutely. This is a worry for all hosts. Um have anecdotes. So I'll tell you the things that people have told me I'm really good at, right? Analogies is one. I'm really good at analogies. I know this. But also, someone said, you always seem to have a story ready to go. And that's true. I actually have a swipe file in my notes app of various stories I think I could tell, right? And I try to relate those stories to stuff I'm talking about. So, if psychology and demeanor come up, I can talk about the time I almost got robbed in Chicago, right? If we're talking about um, community and uh, like how you can form bigger bonds, I could better bonds with the people you work with. I could talk about when I went on Kairos in high school, or I could talk about the time we went to this lake house with this group of students in a student group I was part of. And so if you have some stories holstered that are pretty well rehearsed, um, then you can do a good job of not being boring, keeping the people interested, right? I think one of the stories I tell the most, or at least I used to tell the most, was um, about the first website I ever made, right? And so I say I kind of accidentally, it was divine intervention. Me becoming a web developer became divine intervention, right? So just those words, like what can he possibly mean? Making websites was an act of God, right? So there I've created some tension already and I've opened a curiosity loop. And then I say, my first paying client was my church. They came to me and they said, "Hey, Joe, we know you're good with computers. Can you make us a website?" And at first I said, "No, I don't know how to make a website." And then they said, "We'll pay you." And I said, "Yes, I can make a website for you." And they paid me 200 whole dollars for that website back in 2001. So like having stories like that ready to go can make you seem less boring. Amy's asking a really good question. Do you tell your own stories if you're interviewing a guest, or do you want them to bring their own stories? You want to try to keep it pretty focused on the guest, I would say. Um, if the guest is interesting. And this is again where research and pre-interview come in, right? Because and I've made this mistake before. I did like 7 interviews in 2 days, where 5 of those interviews were on the same day. And the fourth one I don't feel was very good, because I was getting pretty fatigued and the guest just kind of answered the questions more directly. And so in that case, I would paint a bigger picture with more context for this guest to maybe expand or expound talk a little bit more about the topic, right? And this is where your skill as an interviewer comes in. And this is something that you only do by interviewing more. So I would say, like, don't hog the mic. Tell relevant stories when possible, for sure, right? Because the other, what hidden mistake are we on? Number 9. The other hidden mistake that people make, especially with interview shows, right, is that they're not using that to build their own authority at all. And your audience knows, likes, and trusts you if they're coming back to listen to your show. So you want to keep leveraging your own podcast for your own authority. And so when you have guests contribute, right, you're having a conversation, and a conversation is usually a back and forth. So yeah, maybe a couple of stories here and there. You don't want to be talking the whole time though. Because people feel that too. Like, and especially if someone came to listen to the guest, or the guest is like, well, this is just a waste of time. It feels like you're just using me for prompts. That doesn't feel great. So it's kind of a delicate balance. And again, it kind of depends on the comfort level. It's all this. These are all very annoying answers, right? Because it's like a lot of it depends. But um, that same day, I also interviewed Tim Stoddart of Copy Blogger, and he's great. I didn't even have to ask him any questions. Like, I just would prompt him with a couple of sentences, and then he would just tell amazing stories. And so I think that it depends on the guest, and kind of doing a vibe check right in the beginning to see where the guest is at should determine for you how many stories you should tell, and what else you should bring to the table. I think anybody should just have like 4 or 5 stories that they can tell, right? Because if you're going to go on podcasts, you're the guest, you want to have these good stories. The best advice I've ever gotten is that when you think your guest is done speaking, wait. The best nuggets come when you wait for more. This is great, right? So this is my friend Mike Pacquione. He's a speaking coach, and an amazing one at that. Um, he talks about how we don't sit in silence enough, and silence is what helps things land. First of all, right? So the guest makes a point. Just take a minute, not a whole minute, not a literal minute. That's a long time. But take a few seconds and let it land, because now people are thinking about it. And then the other thing, right? This is also a negotiation tactic, right? Where the first person to speak loses. So like in general, I think we should be more open to silence. But that's a great point. Thank you. I'm going to assume Zach again. Yes, Zach. That's a really great point. Let's see. Did I miss any questions here? I'm really far away from the mic now. Sorry about that. Oh, how much of a priority should a podcast be to make it worth pursuing as a growth strategy for your business? Dang, I'm going to assume Emily asking this. What a great question. Um, this is a great question. Who was that speaking coach you just mentioned? Mike Pacquione. So I want to get that answered before I go into this, because I have a lot of opinions about it. Mike Pacquione, if you go to howibuilt.it/standby, I interviewed him on my podcast. He's amazing. Oh man, I don't have the episode number readily available here. 302. howibuilt.it/302. You can find his links and also my interview with him. howibuilt.it/302. Mike Pacquione, he's awesome. He's like I consider him a friend now. I've known him for about a year or so. Super smart. Coaches every speaker at Craft and Commerce. He's coached like Amy Porterfield. He's coached athletes and Olympians. Awesome. Okay, so how much of a priority should a podcast be to make it worth pursuing as a growth strategy for your business? This is tough because it's going to be different for everybody, right? But I think that a podcast can serve, if done right, if the planning is done right, it can serve as a couple of different things. So first of all, it's content. You're creating long form content when you create a podcast. Even if it is a 5 to 10-minute podcast, right? A 10-minute podcast is like, I don't know, 1,500 words in blog post form maybe. And so you're creating long form content. if you have your video on, even if you don't release the full video, you have the opportunity to create short form video clips for those first, TikTok and um, Instagram and YouTube Shorts, right? So on one level, it doesn't need like you don't need to get a lot of downloads on your podcast for you to get ROI in other areas, right? Because maybe you interview a guest on local SEO in Amarillo and you think, wow, this is really good content that will help other agency owners. I'm going to take this podcast and turn it into a blog post, right? And if you're thinking about GoWP, Emily, I know this great agency that has uh, uh, dedicated copywriters and content writers that you can hire to take a blog post or to take a podcast and turn it into a blog post. Um, so that's on one level, right? On the other level, I like to describe podcasts as like a seventh date, right? A lot of people think it's the first date, right? It's the profile on Tinder that you're gonna swipe left or right on. I don't know which way is accept, because I happily was um, dating and married before the advent of such apps. Um, but people think a podcast is a first date when it's actually like the seventh date. People discover you through social channels or through your other long form content, and then they come to your podcast to know, like, and trust you. So the podcast is designed to deepen the relationship, which is why I've spent a lot of time today talking about how you can organically and inorganically, I guess, but mostly organically, improve the discoverability of your podcast by making sure you're ranking for certain words and your descriptions and titles are good and you're finding lookalike audiences. Because podcasting is a long game, right? And so I would say if you're dedicated to a strong content strategy, omni-channel content strategy, a podcast is a really good opportunity to be, if not the centerpiece of it, like maybe your long form blog posts are the centerpiece, then another medium for people to consume, right? You can take those long form blog posts and read them like a script on your podcast. And that gives people another way to consume. So I hope I answered your question. I think that if you're going to do it, then you need to make it like a regular part of your week or your month, um, where you batch, let's say 4 or 5 episodes, like you take a day or two and batch 4 or 5 episodes, and then get them scheduled out. But it could be a really good way to uh, deepen relationships, right? I podcasting is not great for discovery right now. It's really good for deepening relationships. And this is the last thing I'll say on it, right? For discovery, that's rapidly changing because Spotify has changed their interface. So like podcasting Spotify in the app is very TikTok like, where it's just vertical and you can scroll and you get a 1 minute preview. And if you like it, you can click through. And if you don't, you just keep on scrolling. And YouTube is now into podcasting. And so they're going to put all of their algorithmic discovery juice um, behind podcasting as well. So this is why we want to think about those organic things and we want to make sure that we are everywhere. I guess number 10, nice round number, make sure your podcast is everywhere, not just in Apple Podcasts, not just in Spotify. You want to be on YouTube and all of the other directories as well. So focusing on that and understanding that podcasting is about deepening relationships, you use the discovery levers that we talked about, and then you bring people to your podcast where they can learn to know, like, and trust you. And that's where it becomes a growth strategy to turn new people into customers. And that is really when you have tight alignment with the mission of your business and the mission of your podcast. So that's everything that I have. Um, if you are interested and you go to podcastliftoff.com/audit, I will apply that really 10-point framework to your podcast and give you a 15-minute personalized video on how you can improve your show and hopefully grow a little bit more. Um, so perfect. Podcastliftoff.com slash podcast dash audit, or audit will redirect to that longer name. So if you're interested, definitely check it out. Otherwise, I'm on all of the social networks, including Threads, as at J Casabona. But thanks so much for being here. And if you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was great. And I tried to get when I typed in the audit, it redirected podcast/audit. But yeah, audit/audit works as well. So you can go to podcastliftoff.com/audit to check that out. That was so great, Joe. Really great. I felt like, and thanks everyone who showed up, because I felt like we were kind of having a conversation there in the comments, which was fun. So I really appreciate everyone who was able to attend live today and engage in the chat there. It was really, really great and made for some really helpful guidance from our podcasting expert, Joe Casabona. So thank you, Joe.
My pleasure. Were some of the things you had in mind addressed in these?
They were, because that's what I always struggle with. We try to do so much as marketers or business owners, and you always want to be doing the most and making sure your time is well spent also, right? So a podcast is an undertaking, and to do it well, it's going to take some time, especially in the start, right? And then once you're able to batch, like you were talking about, and put some processes in place, it gets easier. But yeah, that's the concept I always struggle with, how much are we going to prioritize this podcast, and is it worth it? And yeah, so that's something to wrestle with in your mind. But I love having you in our community, and your great advice and guidance is always so helpful. So thank you. Thank you to everyone who was able to join today, and we'll be back next month with more from Joe.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks everybody. Thanks, Emily. I'll see you soon.